Introducing ISOServer 2004 Enterprise Edition. I so wish I had the Star Trek intro music right now. You know, the one, doo-doo, space, the final frontier, doo-doo, you know, it's kind of like the exciting intro. I searched for it. I couldn't find it anywhere. I guess I found out through my searching that Warren G., a rap artist, has redone the Star Trek intro music, and that kind of freaks me out. It's a travesty. So anyway, the Enterprise Edition is going to be what we're talking about here. I already digressed far too far. And we're going to take a look at what this is all about. And I kind of chuckled when I wrote the title of this as in Introducing ISOServer 2004, like you haven't seen it at all up to this point. The Enterprise Edition is exactly the same thing as the ISOServer 2004 Standard Edition. You're not going to see any new interfaces, any new firewall capabilities. All that we've done is expanded the management functionality. And that's really, I guess I'm getting a little too deep already, but that's really all the Enterprise Edition allows you to do is get a more centralized managed look and feel for ISOServer. So what we're going to do in this nugget is we're going to walk through the ISOServer Enterprise, take a look at why it's different than ISOServer Standard. There's actually 4 reasons that I have that people would use this instead of this. We'll also talk about the new Atom storage, which is a new little widget that Microsoft came up with that I'm going to leave a secret for now because it is a pretty cool thing, and I want to make sure that it's I build up the excitement a little bit. What's Atom? It's kind of like that. What's .NET? Except we still don't know what .NET is. After this, you'll understand what Atom is. We also have understanding the ISA enterprise structure. What is the let's see, what's the best way I can put this? What is the build-out of ISOServer Enterprise? How are you going to install this into your organization and manage a full organization through this platform? And then, of course, finally, we're going to walk through the installation of the ISOServer Enterprise Edition and talk about how we can use it and create enterprise policies that dictate what our lower-level arrays can do. You'll see all that there as well. We'll do a complete install of the Enterprise Edition. ISOServer 2004 Standard Edition and Enterprise Edition are exactly the same thing, with the exception of what I call the Big 4 enterprise features. These 4 are the reason why you would deploy ISOServer Enterprise Edition. The first is a firewall array, meaning that the firewall has now become redundant, and it uses a shared configuration. So if I add a filtering rule on one of the firewalls, it's added on all of them. If I remove a rule, it's removed from all of them. Using that shared configuration, it duplicates between all of the different firewalls within the array. Second off, is web caching now uses CARP. And look at the size of that CARP. That thing's huge. Big old dirty fish. CARP is the Caching Array Routing Protocol. What that does is it distributes the cache between your ISOServers to where it is never duplicated. Instead of having 3 separate 20 gig cache arrays where it stores the cache content, it will actually use the 20 gigs and combine it all to a 60 gig, and at the same time implement a type of load sharing to where the ISOServers will distribute the load of the cache between themselves, so the clients will not always be tagging one of the ISOServers from the array to obtain the cache content. That's only supported in the Enterprise Edition. The third one is Network Load Balancing, or Microsoft calls it NLB. This allows your ISOServers to all respond to the same IP address. And Windows actually supports this feature. It allows multiple servers to respond to a single IP, and that's used for load balancing and failover. So it can fail between them. Now you might wonder, well, I mean, if that's a Windows feature, why is ISOServer toting it in Enterprise Edition? Can't you do the same thing with the Standard? Well, you could, but you'd lose a lot of functionality, meaning it would just mainly be redundancy. It wouldn't be all that much load balancing. And with the network load balancing in ISOServer, it becomes part of the ISOServer config, meaning that ISOServer actually manages the load balancing. It adds it to the ISOServer management console. It actually monitors the health of the load balancing in the dashboard. You're able to see how the load balancing is doing, all the state of all the servers. It will be enabled on an array level, meaning all the servers within that array respond to the same IP. And it introduces some additional load sharing features that IsoServer supports that isn't typically contained in network load balancing within Windows. So that's the third reason. The fourth and final, and I would say, it's one of the biggest reasons, is the enterprise policies and networks. When you use IsoServer Enterprise Edition, you will have enterprise policies and array policies. And this allows a very large organization to pass worldwide policies, I guess you could say, for their organization. Meaning, no matter what, nobody is able to use, we'll say, peer-to-peer file sharing applications. So they create these policies that are enterprise policy that apply to all firewalls everywhere in the entire enterprise. Now, the cool thing is you have the control of whether you want your enterprise policies to be applied before all of the individual array policies or after. See, by applying them before the array policies, that means they get the precedence. An array level administrator, meaning if we were thinking of this in like terms of a central site and branch sites, the branch site administrator can in no way overrule the enterprise policy if you apply them before the array level policies. Likewise, you have the control of putting them after the array level policies, which kind of has the effect of allowing the array level administrator to typically overrule what you have as an enterprise policy, but know that if they forget to do something, it's covered by the enterprise policy. Enterprise networks allow you to define a network entity that applies to the whole enterprise, and I'll talk more about that later. Now, one of the huge improvements that IsoServer 2004 Enterprise Edition totes over 2000 is the addition of the new Atom storage. And it was IsoServer 2004 that introduced me to this Atom concept that Microsoft has been secret ninja-like developing behind the scenes. Let me first off talk about what the problem was with IsoServer 2000 Enterprise Edition back in 2000. They integrated IsoServer 2000 Enterprise Edition heavily with Active Directory, meaning you had to have a domain, and pretty much when you install IsoServer 2000, it changes the schema of Active Directory. I mean, everything changes, which first off eliminates anybody that's not using Active Directory. I mean, there's organizations, believe it or not, that do not use Active Directory. They might use Netscape Directory or some other system. Totally eliminates them from running IsoServer Enterprise Edition. And also, anytime you modify the schema of Active Directory, that's a big deal. I mean, for some organizations, that's like a mind-blowing, life-altering process that deals with a completely separate group of administrators and has a huge level of impact associated with the organization. A lot of administrators, I mean, a lot of times they'll divide the firewall admins from the firewall admins kind of fall under the network infrastructure group and so on, and then Active Directory admins are a totally different group, and there's a political boundary there. It's kind of like, don't touch my schema. That's just something you don't mess with the Active Directory. So whenever they ran IsoServer 2000 Enterprise, they would have to go through a lot of hoops if they were trying to integrate it with the rest of the network. Yikes, not a good deal. So with IsoServer 2004, Microsoft created the Active Directory Application Mode, or aka Atom. And this was actually planned since since Windows 2000. They had this Atom structure, and it wasn't just for IsoServer, it's just IsoServer starting to bring it to the forefront, at least it did for me. This is kind of like a standalone Active Directory deployment. That's what Atom is. It can run on Windows XP, it can run on Windows 2003, it can run just about anywhere, and it has nearly all the same functionality as a full Active Directory structure. What it's there for, and you can see application mode, it's to run a parallel Active Directory structure that applications can modify the schema, they can do whatever they want, without actually impacting the Active Directory infrastructure of an organization. It's pretty powerful. It's like bringing up a secondary Active Directory structure that has the full capability to replicate with an organization's Active Directory structure, the real one. So you could actually suck all the users and groups out of that into this parallel universe called Atom that IsoServer can integrate into and manage. pretty powerful. And that, I mean, this is a picture that's much bigger than IsoServer. As a matter of fact, let me slap this up there. That's the web link if you're interested in learning some more about Atom. And if you go there, the funny thing is you hardly will see anything about IsoServer at all. Atom is kind of a, it's a new system, a totally new system that Microsoft is building to allow a parallel Active Directory implementation. It's pretty interesting if you really get into it. I did some definite reading on there, and it's exciting where it's going. Now, in IsoServer, as it applies to IsoServer 2004, Atom is managed through a configuration storage server. And they're starting to overlap acronyms here with CSS. CSS is a formatting standard, if you haven't seen it, for HTML. But they're using CSS to describe something that has the power to manage the configuration of the IsoServer enterprise. So when you install IsoServer, you have the ability to set up a CSS, and you'll have to have at least one CSS in your organization which has the control and has the power to make changes to the IsoServer configuration. Now, your organization may just have one CSS, or it might have many CSSs. However, it's like Active Directory domain controllers. The more of them you add, the more replication you have. So you usually won't have a ton of CSSs if you don't have to. Before we get into the configuration of IsoServer Enterprise Edition, I wanted to expound a little on the CSS and also the understanding the enterprise picture, because there's a lot of kind of nuances of the enterprises that you'll want to know. When you configure IsoServer 2004 for the Enterprise Edition, you will create what's known as IsoServer Enterprise. And this is going to be your central point of your authority. You're going to install a CSS server first, which is the one that will create the enterprise. And then from there, you can go down and start creating the individual arrays. Now, an array can be one or more different servers that have separate policies applied to it. The key of an array, you can see right here an array, is that you have servers inside that share the same configuration. It's kind of like a redundant server, if you will. You can think of it just like these servers are all the same, they just share the same configuration. Now, even though I have this picture right here of an array where you have the CSS and the servers, it doesn't take a CSS to run an array. I want to make sure I emphasize that point. You don't need a CSS server for each one of these arrays. You can have one CSS in your entire enterprise that manages the configuration for everything. So what I could do is I could, install, let's say I install a single CSS server up here. That's my beginning point, and I'll create the enterprise. From there, I can actually, on that CSS server, even start creating the arrays. I can say, you know what, I want to create array number 1, which will house my servers in Washington. And in Washington, they're going to have this policy, and this policy. Then from there, I'm going to create the array for, we'll go ahead and say this is California. And the servers in California will have this policy, this policy, this policy. So I'll have separate policies that I define for each and every array. Now notice I only have one CSS, and I could go ahead and set up servers in each one of them, not needing a CSS at all. Even though this picture shows a CSS inside of an array, the CSS will be in one of the array, but every array does not have to have one. Does that make sense? The CSS just holds the configurations that everybody has. Now, with that being said, you can have as many CSSs as you want. It's a hard one to say, CSSs. CSS, the more CSS you have, it's like having more domain controllers. You're going to have more replication, more communication between those. So, of course, having all of them be CSSs may not be the best idea because you're going to have crazy replication traffic. But the rule of thumb is normally that each location should have a CSS. And the primary reason behind that is because these servers will get their configuration from the CSS. They'll pull it from there. And once every 15 seconds, the servers will actually, it's a pull type replication. It's not the CSS pushing out new configs. It's these servers saying, I want to see if you have any new configs for me. And the CSS says, oh yeah, here's a new firewall rule or something like that. So they're pinging that CSS every 15 seconds, and if you put that CSS across the WAN line in a slow wide area network connection, it can start bogging it down. So typically you're going to have a CSS in each location, and if you have an array per location, so be it. That will be where each CSS is. Now, the enterprise policies that you create will apply to each and every one of these arrays. So if I go ahead and say I deny port 80 for everybody, I can set that up to where that is then pushed out to all the different arrays as the first policy, meaning it goes before all of the array level policies that people can define. So no matter what they do, port 80 is still denied. Even if they put permit port 80 after that, remember, it processes them in order, so that's how it works. So that's kind of the structure that we see in the enterprise. Again, we have enterprise policies, array levels, CSS being that be-all, end-all server that holds the server configuration. Oh, one more thing. If the CSS goes down, are we devastated? Is that a single point of failure? No, it's not, in the sense that you won't be able to make any new configuration changes with the CSS offline. However, the servers will keep their most recent configuration that they did get from the CSS. It is pretty critical to back up the CSS server because that's going to be the one that you restore to get your network up and running. However, these servers are just, I mean, they're going to keep their same configuration, so there's no reliance on a single server in the network. As we get into the configuration of IsoServer Enterprise Edition, I'm going to go ahead and pop out my CD-ROM and stick in the CD. There's a couple more things I want to mention to you about the CSS, since it is such an important server. The CSS, first off, can only be installed on Windows 2003 server. Pretty huge nuance, eh? So CSSs have to be running on Windows 2003, can't be Windows 2000. Also, you can choose to install the CSS in a work group or in a domain. So you don't have to have a domain environment, but if you don't install CSS into a domain environment with all the necessary trust relationships and so on, you can only have one CSS server. Now that could be a pretty huge consideration depending on your environment. Now, when I usually think about a enterprise level environment, I don't usually think work group. I usually think of Active Directory domains. And joining this machine to the domain doesn't mean that it has to be a domain controller. No, not at all. It could be just a member server just fine. So there's really no special requirements. You don't need to update the schema at all. But do know that if you are using just work groups, you can only have one CSS. Right. That's all I had to say about that. Now you can see I've popped in the CD, it popped up Enterprise Edition, and I will hit Install IsoServer 2004. Now, those of you that had some experience with IsoServer 2000 may remember on the screen it actually forced us to say Update Schema. That was one of the options to tweak your whole Active Directory schema in order to support this. So I'm going to click on Next. I mean, everything looks very similar. Oh, and there is, of course, my product serial number that I'll have to go back. You're probably seeing black dots, but I don't right now, so I'm going to have to add the black dots to this video later on. I'll go ahead and just click on OK. Now, this is where it starts to differ from the standard edition installation. Look at this. Setup scenarios. Choose the scenario that best describes you. 1, install IsoServer services. So this is pretty much just an array member, a normal IsoServer. Do you want to install a CSS, a configuration storage server? So this is how we will set up our CSS, and this has to be the first one in the enterprise, so that'll be what we do. Right here. Install both IsoServer services and the configuration storage server. So this will be an array member and it will be a configuration master for the enterprise. Just this one will only store the configuration. It won't actually participate in the firewall process. That would be for an extremely large organization that can dedicate a computer just as the master CSS server. And then finally, if you're on like a Windows XP box and you would like to manage your enterprise array remotely, which I almost can guarantee you will. That's where you'll just install IsoServer management functionality, and that will give you the MMC on a Windows XP workstation. Especially when you're managing so many servers, that's a big one to add in there. So, excuse me. We have the ISA server. You can see the advanced logging characteristics, which gives you the MSDE, the database. And then down here I have the ISA server management, so I can manage it from the server. Why not? I'll add the firewall client installation share. I'll skip the message screener since we're not publishing Exchange servers. And then right here, this is the CSS. This is the enterprise configuration. So we've got all those checked. I hit next. The big question. Are you creating a new ISA server enterprise, or are you simply creating a replica of the enterprise? This is used if you're adding a second CSS or third or fourth to your enterprise. Since this is the first CSS that we're adding, we're going to create a new enterprise. And when we hit next, it's going to give us this warning that says, hey, for the most effective deployment, you should only have a single enterprise. And it gives you this little dissertation on how it's not good to have multiple enterprises, because then you don't really have true central management. You have multiple enterprise policies. So we're only installing one enterprise. That's all I got enough PCs for. So I go ahead and hit next. And now it's saying, what is your internal network? What is your internal network range that you would like to define? I'll click on add. And this is very similar to what it was with the, sorry, I was just wondering where my external connection went, and I forgot I had the cable unplugged, but that's okay. This is just the internal networks that I'm defining. I'm going to say just internal right there is the only one that I want to add in. Click on OK. It says, OK, you now have the addresses. Choose next. Same question from the standard installation. Allow non-encrypted firewall client connections. That allows the old version of the firewall client. I'll skip that and hit next. And it says this will be restarted. So you can see just about everything is the same. Remote management I'm accessing this server through remote desktop. So it says I've automatically configured remote management from your IP. That's cool. Click next and install. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this. This will take a good, 4 or 5 minutes to complete. But this will install all of the enterprise settings on this server. Everything will be good to go. And you can see the only difference from the standard edition is now it's asking us what kind of enterprise we're creating. So go ahead and pause the recording while that installs and come back when it's done and after we've rebooted. Alright, through the magic of video, 4 to 5 minutes has passed, and we have rebooted. So I've now got this machine back up to where it should be, running the ISA Server Enterprise. I'm going to go ahead and open the Enterprise Management. I know this is below your screen. I'm just going into the ISA Server and opening the Enterprise Management. Wow, let me get that sized up right and brought into the screen. Now you can see that this Enterprise Management that I have right here, the Enterprise Edition, we have now the left side, just like we're used to, the middle where it's all pretty and gooey, and then down here is our swoosh bar. So it's everything that we're used to working with in the ISA server. Now you see on this side, this is new. We now have a category called Enterprise and a category called Arrays. Now the first thing I want to make sure you know is that the name of this computer that I installed this on, just bring up a command prompt, is ISA04. So right underneath here, it by default created an array called ISA04. More on that later. But we're going to start off right here at the enterprise, looking at the enterprise policies. And right here it says, step by step, what would you like to do? The first thing that you'll want to do, and this is regardless of whether you're in a domain or you're in a workgroup environment. I'm in a workgroup right now. But you'll want to right-click on the enterprise, or you could even click on this right here. Go to Properties, and Assign Roles. This will allow you to specify who your enterprise administrators are. So I have the ability to go in here and start, jumping down, and let me just do a find. I have, all of my this is just a junk directory, just my users and whatnot that I've been playing with throughout this series. And there's my Jeremy. I'm going to assign Jeremy as an enterprise administrator. Now you can also assign them as an enterprise auditor, which just has read-only access, so they can see the config, but they can't do anything about it. Don't you love this sense of power? So you go ahead and add our administrator to the list. We've got Jeremy now. Click on OK. It says go ahead and apply the configuration. Voila. we've assigned an administrative role. Now, if you're in a domain, you'll want to do that to your firewall admins. And the cool thing about IsoServer is just because somebody is an enterprise administrator, you know, the Active Directory above all, be all group, doesn't mean dirt to the IsoServer. I mean, Active Directory is one thing, but one of the beauties of ISO 04 is they have pulled ISA out of the Active Directory and put it into the Atom database and the Atom directory service. So now we can assign the enterprise admins full rights, but who's to say that the enterprise admins in Active Directory know anything at all about the firewall? So those roles we assign can be anything. Now we come down here to the enterprise policies. And we see that right now we have a default policy. This cannot be changed, modified, or removed. It's just kind of a, you see right here, cannot be modified. No rules can be added, and the only thing that it is a deny all. So by default, the enterprise says everybody is denied. Now we will need to modify that rule. But before we get into the policies and creating another enterprise policy, you also see this enterprise networks. Now let me just expand down here just so you don't get confused. You see down here I have networks under the arrays as well. Now array networks are just like the networks that we've been working with all the way up till this series until now. You can add array networks that apply to just this array of IsoServer computers, and it affects only that array. Now, anytime you add in an enterprise network to the enterprise, that network can be used in both enterprise policies and array policies. So if I go here and I go new enterprise network, let's say this is Jeremy's network. I'll add a range in, and I'll just say, oh, for grins, 208.590.208.59255. So I've added the range of IP addresses in, hit finish, and now that network will be available to any policies that I create for the enterprise, and it's also a network that will be available to anything that we're creating in the array. Now it doesn't show up as an array network, these are specific to the array, but when we're adding policies to an array, that's where they'll show up. Now, the enterprise policies are the be-all, end-all policies that the array administrators cannot overrule. For example, I'm going to create an enterprise network. I'll go new, well, no, I've got Jeremy's network. Let's use that one. I'll go to enterprise policies. I'll hit new enterprise policy. And the name of this policy will be the overlords, because we are overlording it over everybody else. Now you can see it's kind of like, that was it? What's up with that? We created a policy that has nothing. Well, that's because the policy is nothing more than a placeholder. We then have to go in and add rules to this policy. Now you can see that the policy, as everything in IsoServer, has by default a last rule that denies everything. So I can go ahead to my overlords policy, hit new, access rule. And in the access rule, I'll just go ahead and say this is to deny Jeremy's networks. Okay, can you see where I'm going with this? I have the action to take, deny. Next, what am I doing? I'm selected protocols. I'm going to say all outbound traffic. From these sources, I'll go ahead and add in network sets. We'll say all networks. This goes from all source networks to Jeremy's network. You see the enterprise network right here. Click on add. Now what I'm doing is I'm saying I don't care where they are in the organization. I'm an overlord, right? It doesn't matter if they're in the array or where they're at. I never want anybody in my entire organization to have access to Jeremy's network. Kind of ironic now that I think about it. I'm going to go ahead and click next. All users, of course. Next. Finish. And just like that, you see Jeremy's network shows up right here. But be careful. Look at this. It says enterprise policy rules applied after the array firewall policy. What that means is somebody in the array could overrule this rule by adding their own firewall policy right here. For instance, let me hop down to the array. First off, ISA04, that's the default array that it created when I installed it, is using the default policy. I'm going to change that over to using, and all I did, by the way, was right-click on the array, and I'm going to change it over to use the overlords policy, and click OK. So that way, the default policy is just the deny all. Now it's using the one that I created. Now look what happens when I click on the firewall policy. You see this? It says you have the enterprise policy rules applied after your firewall policy. So I, as the ISA04 array administrator, can now come in here and add my own rules, even one that completely beats this deny Jeremy network. No, we don't want that. We're the overlords, right? What we want is we want deny Jeremy's networks to go up here before the array firewall policy. So before any of their rules are processed, it processes that one. Now, it's not too tough to do. All I need to do is right-click on that and say, move up, moving on up, moving on up. And right here we have deny Jeremy's networks, has gone right up to before the firewall policies. And now any rules that we create in the array has to be after I've denied Jeremy's networks. Make sense? That's pretty much, I mean, the beauty is there's not too much to the enterprise policies and the arrays once you see how they work. Now, we are sitting on the CSS right now, the mega major server in the network that we're going to do all of our configuration on. Remember, the CSS is the one that has the configuration database. All the other servers, unless I add more CSSs, are just going to add in to the arrays. One of the things that you'll want to do, well, you don't have to, but it's usually good practice, is before you start adding other servers into your enterprise, create more arrays. Go ahead and create the shells that they're going to be in. Watch this. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the array. I'll go ahead and hit New Array. And we'll say this is the Washington array. Array DNS name, this will be what they use when they join it. I'll just say Washington. It says what enterprise policy should apply to this new array? Overlords is the one I want. Probably won't ever use that default policy if you're doing this. Hit next. Now right here it says what kind of firewall rules can be created in this array. Look at this. We have complete control over whether somebody can create deny rules, allow rules, or publish servers in their array. If we uncheck this, people will not be able to create allow rules to allow access to other things other than what we've defined in the enterprise. You see how restrictive we can be here? We can really say the enterprise policy is all that you get. I'm going to go ahead and click next and finish. Oh, geez. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording. By the way, creating arrays, I don't know why, but it's very slow. It really does go this slow. It's going to tick, tick, tick. It takes about 2 minutes in order for the ISO server to create a new array. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this recording and then come back once it's done. There we go. We've got the new array successfully created. Go ahead and click on OK. Now you can see that we have the Washington array that is now, and you can see right here, I am selected on array. It's showing what enterprise policies apply and what people are allowed to do in those arrays. I'm going to create arrays for every major section of my organization. Because when you do an install of an ISO server and you say it's not a CSS, or even if you do say it's a CSS, it will say what array do you want to install it into. If you haven't pre-created the arrays, you're just going to throw them all in the first one and then just have to move them later. Let me show you that. You can see right here it created an array with the name of the first server I ever installed. It doesn't have to stay that name. I can delete the array, move the array, rename the array. But underneath here, under the configuration, you see a section that was never in our ISO server standard. That was the servers. Servers shows what servers are in that array and all the stats about them. Now I can go to the properties of this and I have, pretty much everything about that server, how much load factor it should have for CARP, the caching array protocol, what kind of communication, what IP address it should use to communicate with other people in the array. But all of that is specific to that server and that array. By creating the arrays beforehand, you can install servers directly in here. Like you can see in Washington, there's no servers. So at that point, what you see, I'm just trying to make sure, have we talked about most everything? You see the enterprise policies, We've talked about creating those. The array level policies have to adhere to the enterprise policy, and then whatever rules we want to add that's specific to the array, we can do that. We've got the servers that are underneath there, underneath the arrays, create them, add servers in there. Yeah, I think we've talked about just about everything that enterprise adds to our organization. Well, let's go ahead and wrap everything up. Taking a look at the ISOServer Enterprise Edition. To hit the high points, we walked through and talked about the big four reasons why we would use the ISOServer Enterprise over the ISOServer Standard. And primarily, they all focus around the load sharing and the fact that we can load balance between the servers within an array. We talked about how we have extra redundancy, and I guess primarily would be the centralized management of the entire ISOServer policies for a large organization. We saw the new Atom, the new Active Directory that Microsoft has come up with to allow people to create applications that install into Active Directory without actually modifying the entire schema for the Active Directory for your organization. We then went through the ISOServer enterprise structure, talked about the components of the enterprise, what enterprise policies did, and the CSS server, where those fit in, and how arrays fit into the grand scheme of things. Then we walked through the configuration of ISOServer Enterprise Edition, and I realized there is a lot more that you can do with this. You can install multiple servers into an array. There is a ton that you can do with the Enterprise Edition, but just by seeing that structure, how we can create the enterprise policies and the array policies and so on. Really, you've seen everything that you need to know when you're configuring the Enterprise Edition. All the rest is just putting servers in specific places and choosing how you want to distribute the load between them. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.